Cool. Okay. Thanks for the introduction. So I'm happy to be the last talk before lunch. Today we will have two cryptography talks, me and by Benny in the afternoon. Both of us are talking about something in the theory side of cryptography, deeply related to theoretical computer science. And I guess both talk it's in the information theoretical crypto region, in the sense that we don't use much of crypto assumptions. Okay, so this talk, the pairwise independence of substitution-permutation network, this is a joint work with Stefano and Vinod. This is a work accepted in crypto last year. Okay, so a central object in crypto and also in theoretical computer science is to construct random-looking key-date permutations. So tons of work are targeting these problems. And among these works, there's actually a well-known gap between theory and practice. So the theory committee tend to call this object pseudo-random permutation, or maybe we would just read PRP. And here we want to have proof of security based on some well-understood assumptions. Well, in the other side, there's a practical side. They are okay with heuristic security, and their first priority is to have very efficient constructions. Okay, so this gap is it's part of a stereotype. It's not very accurate. Of course, theory work would also care about the efficiency, but practical work also won't proof. But this is a well-known gap. Okay. So in the literature, we already know that with system network plus PRF, pseudo-random functions, we can have pseudo-random permutations. And PRF can be constructed from one-way functions, from factoring, and many other assumptions. On the practical side, we have some very efficient block ciphers. For example, AES. This is widely used everyday internet traffic. Maybe, I guess, 80% of the encryption or 90% is encrypted by AES. Okay, so both sides surely want to understand whether this well-used construction of cipher AES in particular, it's secure. So what does this mean? So from the theory side, we tackle this problem by trying to base AES on assumptions. Okay, but if you know AES, I will introduce what it is. It's very concrete and simple constructions. You can hardly say I base AES on factoring or like lattice, any assumption you can have. So instead, we have many work try to justify the security of AES in some idealized model. Idealized means, okay, we are not studying the actual AES, but we replace something in AES by some idealized primitives. I'll discuss this briefly in the middle of the talk. And okay, then from the practical side, what they are trying, their approach is we emulate all possible attacks. We try to find as many powerful attacks. This is called cryptanalysis. And then we prove that, okay, AES is actually resistant to many attacks. So this is the best we can hope for. If you come up with a new cipher and you prove, okay, this is resistant to many known attacks, people would consider this as a serious attempt on building new ciphers. Okay. So this work, we try to bridge the gap. As we mentioned, the committee has already identified many classes of attacks, and they have already proved that AES is resistant to some class of attacks. This talk, we try to tackle this pictures from the theory side. We introduced the notion. It's not we introduced. We revisit the notion of pairwise independence. So if the key-date permutation we care about is two-wise independent, then it's it implies resistance to differential attacks. If the key permutation is t-wise for larger t-wise independent, then it implies resistance to more attacks. So t-wise independent is a very natural primitive. I guess it's also known for study of hash function. It's known as the universal hash function. What that means, it means this permutation considered key as hidden. You choose any t input. The corresponding t output should be ID uniform. Actually, ID uniform without replacement. And in this talk, we consider a relaxed version of this notion, such that we only require the output to be the joint distribution of the output to be close to uniform. Okay. So for feasibility, the key length has to be larger than t times n because we have t output here. So the entropy of this t output is roughly t times n. And all the entropy comes from the randomness t, so the key has to be at least t times n. And in particular, when studying AES, this can, by assuming the round keys of ES are independently sampled. I'll talk about them later. And okay, so essentially, if a key-data permutation is t-wise independent, it means if I non-adaptively choose t input, then the t corresponding output is random. And in particular, if you consider known attacks, the linear attack and the differential attacks, essentially it's an attack that choose two queries. And high order differential attacks means I choose 2 to the n queries. Sorry, 2 to the d queries. Therefore, if your function is t-wise independent, it implies resistance to these attacks. In particular, quantitatively, if you are very close to t-wise independence, you have good resistance to differential attacks and the linear attack in particular. Okay. Now I'm going to give, okay, maybe first, any questions so far?
Yeah, so great that you asked. So this statistical distance, so what does that mean? What distance measure do you use?
Statistics, okay, I guess here I guess maybe this is a difference in the literature. In our literature, when we say this distance, we mean the total variance distance.
I see, DTV, I see.
Yeah.
Also, yeah, so, but there are other like possibilities such as Wasserstein. Yeah, I understand DTV is natural, but does it make sense to also consider other statistical distance like Wasserstein distance? This is a random question because, yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, I guess maybe yeah. I guess in the crypto, I'm working on cryptography. We overwhelmingly consider total verification distance. It's because that so we would tend to consider like there should be a distinguisher trying to distinguish two words, and that is naturally becomes the DTV distance. Yeah.
I see. Thanks. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. And okay, now I briefly present what's the objects we are going to consider. So what are the block-cipher we will consider today? So first is there's a thing called key alternating cipher. In key alternating cipher, how would you encrypt? Oh yeah. So key-data permutation can be considered as an encryption. So given a input, you XOR it with the key, then you apply a public and fixed permutation. Then you XOR another key and repeat this process. So all the permutation here are public and fixed. Okay. So this is called key alternating cipher. And then substitution permutation network, it's just a special case of key alternating cipher. It also specifies how the permutation is constructed. So here first, it would divide the input into many chunks, each chunk of b bits. And we apply again a public and fix the permutation to each of these chunks. And then we apply a linear functions across them. So here, typically S it's a complicated function, but it's only over a small domain. And the linear function is simple, but it's over a larger domain. So by this combination, we can mix the whole domain and also keep function simple. Okay, so this is the substitution permutation network, or SPN in short. And then AES, the most well-known, well-used encryption scheme. Here it's a special case of SPN. Here the S box, this permutation is called S box. Apply on a chunk of 8 bits, which is 1 byte. And in particular, this function, it's the inverse function. This is the inverse function over the finite field of size 2 to the 8. So this is a yes. Any question here?
So is it clear that if you apply the big box like several S and linear function, it will result in a permutation? You said it's always a permutation, right?
Oh, okay, good point. So this is a linear permutation.
I see.
This S box are also all permutations.
I see. Yeah. Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Actually, there's actually so as this is a TCS talk. So in TCS, there's also a good question: is how can you construct a permutation, a key-data permutation over a large domain? So SPN, it's one approach which we are trying to study, and it's well known that from one-way function we can have key-data functions. We can have pseudo-random function, but to the permutation, you still need some non-trivial work. Okay. So next we'll present our result. So for the key alternating cipher KC, apparently R round KC cannot be R to the 2-wise independent because we only have R plus 1 keys. As we mentioned, it could at most be R plus 1 wise independent. And our result shows that R round KC it's almost R wise independent. So this result is pretty tight. Here we say for most permutation pi 1 up to pi R, as you can expect it, we use this is an extension result, and we use probabilistic methods. Okay. And as I mentioned, there are many work studied the idealized model. What does this mean? Just mention very briefly. In those kind of work, pi is modeled as an ideal random permutation, which means you can only query it. You don't know what the permutation looks like. But in this work, pi would be a completely known fixed permutation. Yeah. So this is our work for KC. Our work for SPN, what we show that when S box, it's the inverse function which is used by AES, or when S box is the cube function which is used by MiMC. In such case, we show that 2 or 3 round SPN, it's already close to 2-wise independence. And in particular for AES, we show we need to do some extra work. We show that 6th round of AES, it's close to 2-wise independence. Okay, compare with previous work, the state of art shows that they show for 4-round AES, it's pointwise close. Okay, maybe you would find that here their closeness is much larger than 1. It might make sense because they consider pointwise closeness. Pointwise closeness basically means like none of the output has two. It's not too large. It's not 2 to the 17 times the uniform. In particular, for AES it's 288 bits to 128 bits to 128 bits. It means the difference. They show that the difference it's at most probability 2 to the minus 111. Yeah. So it's still a meaningful result, but it doesn't imply close to twice independent. Yeah. Another thing is like as our result shows closer to 1/2, smaller than 1/2, close to twice independent, it can be amplified. So therefore, if we repeat more rounds, AES will be exponentially close to twice independent. So any question about the result here? Okay, then I will continue. So from now, I will briefly mention our 2 results. First, the KC result. Okay, so KC, we proved this result by induction. So imagine we already have a T-wise independent key-date permutation F. Okay. And say, okay, of course, you should imagine that later this F would be replaced by a KC later. What if we append 1 round of KC after this T-wise independent key-date permutation? Okay, we show that if you append this 1 more round, it would be close to T+1 wise independent, pointwise close. Yeah, and this only works for most F. This works for most pi. Yeah. Therefore, we actually use probability methods on pi. And as we mentioned, this is a pointwise closeness. So even if our closeness is much larger than 1, it still makes sense. Yeah. And okay. And the next thing is like we relaxed our requirement on F. Now F doesn't have to be T-wise, but it just needs to be close to T-wise. And then here we will show that, okay, appending 1 round, it would also be closer to T+1 wise independence with a larger distance. Yeah. So we call this our independence amplification lemma. So 0 round KAC, which is basically one-time pad, it's perfectly 1 wise independent. Using this independence amplification, 1 round KAC is somewhat 2 wise independent. And then 2 round KAC is somewhat 3 wise independent, and so on, 2R wise KAC. So the next thing we need is a distance amplification lemma. We won't talk too much. It says that if you start from key-date permutation, that it's somewhat T+1 wise independent, but it's very close to T wise independent. Then adding 1 more round, it's also very close to T+1 wise independent. Yeah, so quantitatively, yeah, but you don't need to check the quantitative too much for this talk. So as we mentioned, any round KC, it's 1 round, it's close to 1 wise independent. And by doing independence amplifications, we get somewhat close to T-wise independence by having more rounds. And then by distance applications, we would have actually close to T-wise dependence. So for example, you can maybe let's check here in this box. One round KC is one-wise independence, and it's somewhat two-wise dependence. So you can amplify it to have very close to two-wise independence in two-round case. Oh, yeah. Any question here? Okay, then I will continue. So then I will briefly mention our result for SPN and concretely on AES. The first observation, okay, so for SPN and AES, we only managed to prove close to two-wise dependence. The first observation here is that when you only care about two-wise dependence, you only need to consider difference. Why? Okay, so say you have input x1, x2 fitted into the SPN network. First, they would be XOR with a random key. Then after the XOR, only the difference matters. And similarly, when you consider the output, you want to consider the statistical distance, the statistical distance of the joint distribution of the output is uniform. Then because at the very end, you also XOR random key. So actually it suffices to consider the statistical distance between the difference of the two output. So therefore, for the rest of the talk, I would only consider the difference. Okay. So say you have an input difference delta. So you have two inputs that are different by delta. You fit it into this one round of SPN network. Then what would be the output distribution? What would be the output distribution? Sorry, what would be the distribution of the output difference? Right, as we only care about difference. As we show that for like when S box is inverse or cube, actually like the output difference is just a random vector orthogonal to the input difference. There are some black magic here. Right. So this is therefore we can just replace this process XOR key and S box with sampler to sample orthogonal vector. Okay, so here I say vector because previously I mentioned this to operation over the field of 2 to the b, of set 2 to b. You can also consider it as a vector space of Boolean field of dimension b. Yeah. This is very, very nice, but it's not very precise. Actually, there's something. One thing is like when the input difference is 0, which means there's no input difference, then of course there's no output difference. The other thing is like it's not actually sampling a random sampling so it's actually not delta which is orthogonal to delta and delta prime are orthogonal. You need to also apply a permutation. So here pi and pi prime are two permutations. You actually need to apply a permutation, then sample orthogonal vector, then apply other permutation. But for this talk, it's totally fine to ignore this fact. Actually, you can ignore both facts. They are not so important for this talk. Yeah. Any questions for this lemma? Okay, so if there's no question, okay. So by this lemma, what we have is like as long as we have a non-zero input difference, we would have the output difference would have very high entropy. Yeah, because we only care about the entropy, we don't need to care about the permutation I mentioned in last slide. Okay. So another question is, okay, what if the input difference already has high entropy, what happened to the output difference? As we show in our paper, we call this as extraction lemma, the output would also have, if the input entropy difference already has high entropy, the output difference will be very close to uniform. It's proved by a Fourier analysis, which I won't go into detail in this talk. Okay, and the next thing, as in the SPN network, there are many chunks extracting this this S box and the XOR key in parallel. So what happened to them? We show that as long as each chunk has a high entropy, then the joint distribution of the outcome is close to uniform. Most importantly, I only require each input chunk individually has high entropy. They could be independent. It doesn't have to be independent. They could have high dependency. And moreover, we show that assuming they are independent, then the output will be even closer to uniform. We can actually weaken the requirement. I don't need them to be all independent, as long as any subset jointly has high entropy. Still, there could be some dependency, but as long as any subset has high entropy, then the output is very close to uniform. So quantitatively, this is the closeness to uniform. Note that there's an improvement exponentially on K if the input difference higher has more entropy. Any question here? I guess now I gave you the full pictures.
Sorry, so what does the SD mean in this slide?
Okay, good question. I mean statistical distance, or I guess DT.
Okay, thanks.
So now I want to show that for any starting from any input or from any input difference, the output difference is close to uniform. And as mentioned in this SPN network, the XOR and S box can be replaced by a subspace sampler. So without loss of generality, some input chunk has to be different. So there, the difference is non-zero. And because the sampling, the corresponding output would have high entropy. And then after the linear layer, we need to assume something on the linear function. Then here, everyone would have a high entropy. We need to assume that the linear function has what's it called a full branching number. And then by our lemma, extraction lemma, because each individual one has high entropy, then after this subsampling, they jointly has high entropy. Sorry, they jointly not only have high entropy but also close to uniform. So this is our first result. To be even closer to uniform, we go back one layer. Now we said they all have high entropy, which means with high probability, they are all non-zero. So then we just consider on a non-zero chunk on this layer, they are not all non-zero. And then individually use the subsampling. They independently has high entropy. They independently has a high entropy. What does it mean? It means after the linear layer, any subset here would have high entropy. Then we can use the other extraction lemma, showing that so the output is very close to uniform. So this was our result for 2-round and 3-round SPN. For AES, we need to do some extra work. For AES, we have actually B equals 8. Each trunk only has 8 bits, and K equals 16. So you can see like B is very small. And also because for AES, the linear function is not that nice. It doesn't have full branching number. So for many reasons, we need to do some extra work. And remind that for KC, the more general case, we can do much better, and we can have more than 2x independence.
So, in spite of these sources all have high entropy independently, but if they are highly correlated, how can the output be uniform? Like if they are all equal and the chunks of the output are all equal too.
Sorry, are you mentioning the? Let's see. Let me see.
So this delta, they all have high entropy,
right?
But they can be highly correlated.
Okay, yeah. I don't mean here.
Delta 2.
Delta 2. Okay. You mean here?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Here they could be, but all we care is they are non-zero. They are all non-zero. They could be equal, for example. They could be like all equal. Here, the only property I use in this approach is that delta 2 are all non-zero with high probability.
But you mentioned delta prime 2 is close to uniform. Or you say each of them is close to uniform?
Yeah, they are close to uniform. So maybe from this approach, I already showed that they are close to uniform, but I'm not satisfied with the closeness. So, okay, maybe let's. In this slide, I'm not satisfied with the closeness. So therefore, this is the first one for the 2-round SPN. So instead, there's an alternative approach to prove closeness to uniform for 3-round SPN. For that one, we get a different approach.
I mean, you can ensure that for all I, delta 2 prime I is close to uniform, or they close to uniform as entire tuple.
Yeah. I can show they are close to uniform as an entire tuple already. Yeah.
Okay. But delta prime 2I is only depend on delta 2I. If the delta 2I are all equal, and so as delta 2 prime.
Okay. Yeah. So if you start from here, you cannot go here. This doesn't work. Yeah. The gap from here. So if you already know that delta 2I already individually has high entropy, then you can use one of the extraction lemma to say delta 2 prime is close to uniform.
Okay, I got it.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. Okay, so and let's have a summary. Okay, we already have some. Let's have some more open questions. So TOS dependence is I guess it's a it's relatively new area of studying the on the analysis of concrete ciphers. So there are many questions. One very natural question is like, can you amplify the independency like what we have did in KC? So in particular, can you show AES is 3-wise independence? It would already be a highly non-trivial result. And another thing is the role of key scheduling. As you mentioned, we need more randomness in the maybe, for example, let me go back to the definition. We need all the key to be uniformly sampled. But in reality, all the keys, actually they are derived from the original key by the so-called key scheduling. So how key scheduling come into the picture? And then can you analyze other concrete cipher design? For example, EIX. EIX means you can add here which is add mod 2 to the n, and XOR is essentially add mod 2. So both operations are linear, but the combination of them is non-linear. Yeah. Can you analyze other concrete cipher? Are they two-wise or three-wise independent? And finally, could you, is T-wise dependence implies resistance to other classes of attacks? Yeah. So that's all I want to talk today. Thank you for listening. Any more questions?
So what properties of S is required in the subspace sampling lemma?
Okay, good point. Let me. So maybe first in general. Okay, where is it? Okay. So in general, in the SPN network, typically you need S to be a highly nonlinear function, because all the other operations in SPN network is linear. They use S inverse and S cube as two examples. And what we need in our proof is, it turned out to be, for both S inverse and S cube, we have this subspace sampling lemma. Or I guess, in general, what we need is like when the input difference, any fixed input difference, the output difference here would has very high entropy. That would be the very minimum of what we need. If you say a general property of S-box, of a good S-box, or sufficient condition, I can hardly name it.